would like to welcome everybody in this roundtable, and also those who are joining us online. And let me introduce the panelists here of this entrepreneurship ecosystem. So if you are interested in something else, that entrepreneurship, or as Rolf corrected me, entrepreneurial ecosystem, whatever the term is, so that's a perfect place to be. But if you are interested in some other aspects, please join to the other two or other sessions. Okay, so then let me introduce you first. László Borbély, who is also chairing this one. He's also the advisor of the Romanian Prime Minister office. Yeah, and the second is, what was?
I am in charge to implement Agenda 2030 for sustainable development in Romania, like State Council.
Okay, so he's on the implementation part of this, what we came out, he's going to implement, okay? Then going from moving next, then Eva Komlósi from the University of Pécs, then Markus Desjardins from University of Namur, Belgium, then Alexandra Tsetkova from OECD, the Trento, yeah, Trento, Italy, as far as I know, and Rolf Sternberg from, where are you now? It's always Hanover, University of Hanover. Okay. So the idea of this kind of entrepreneurship ecosystem, I think, is relatively new. So 15 years back, we probably couldn't hold any kind of roundtable or any kind of presentation, because that came out probably sometimes in 2009, 2010, the whole idea, and it's evolved and mushroomed and just grow up. And started something like rather an empirical research. Then it went through some kind of development, of conceptual development. And right now, I think that we are in another phase that everything seems to be entrepreneurship ecosystem or entrepreneurial ecosystem. So it's now, I think it's time to clarify a little bit also the boundaries of this kind of entrepreneurship ecosystem. And let's see what are the promising promising directions of further research. And that was that we asked our panelists, who are also some kind of experts in specific field of entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship ecosystem. Let's try to see their own view about this, how it's going to evolve. So they first give their presentation around 10 minutes, and then we are opening the floor to the others to ask some kind of questions. I can see some others already have some questions, but please, let's start first, okay? So I give the floor to Eva.
Good afternoon, welcome to everyone. My name is Eva Komlósi, and I'm working as an assistant professor here at the University of Pécs, Faculty of Business and Economics, and actually in various forms though, but the topic of entrepreneurial ecosystem and its research have been on my radar for 10 years now, actually, and I'm very honored to be here as a panelist. But to tell you the truth, I think, to be honest, I think I have more questions than answers here after all these years, but maybe this is normal. So my presentation is a stock of relevant thoughts, relevant important findings, and mostly questions about how can we measure entrepreneurial ecosystem. But in my opinion, before we answering this question, we need to remind us why we want to measure so eagerly entrepreneurial ecosystem. And because we, I mean, researchers, we policymakers and people are very mesmerized by strong and successful ecosystems, and we want to understand how they work and the mechanism they operate that operate them, and because we want to interfere and intervene to trigger a more stronger and successful ecosystem. Okay, since the conceptualization won't be my focus, so I won't go into the details, but I just want to mention the term entrepreneurial ecosystem actually jumped to the forefront of the entrepreneurial research around 2010. And now, according to some researcher, it became a buzzword because of its growing popularity. And yes, what we can see here that there is too much, sometimes confusing information on the table. And therefore, we can see that there are some, available literature reviews, usually systematic literature review, which is trying to summarize the main results and findings of these ecosystem-related studies. Actually, the fact is not entirely new. I also conducted a literature review in 2018, and I found that actually researchers have been interested in this topic since the late 1970s, and they are very interested to research this interrelatedness and this interrelatedness of the ecosystem actors and the contextual factors. So I hold the position that ecosystem can be understood by examining this interrelatedness of the different components. Okay, I just would like to mention the most important characteristics or features of entrepreneurial ecosystem according to the literature, because actually these characters, I think, highlight why is it so hard to measure entrepreneurial ecosystem. So first, we know that entrepreneurship is intermediate output of entrepreneurial ecosystem. So we know that a high-level entrepreneurial ecosystem can better propel the entrepreneurial discovery process, which ultimately leads to a high level of productive entrepreneurship. Also, we know, actually, if I remember well, William Gardner said or wrote in 1985 that entrepreneurships like kaleidoscopes, so they are very heterogeneous. And also we know that they are unique because they are surprise place-based. And what we know that they cannot be replicated. Philip Roundtable wrote that actually the initial conditions of entrepreneurial ecosystem are very important. And I remember Mack and Meyer study, they wrote that during the life cycle of entrepreneurial ecosystem, there are several shocks, and they have to handle these shocks, and of course, therefore, they are very path dependent. Also, we know that entrepreneurial ecosystems are complex adaptive systems. Actually, here's a discipline, sociology, which deals with this issue. Think about sociology, try to focus on how the different primary and secondary institutions like family, education, the economy, the religion, all these, the different social institutions affect the different actors, and also it deals with social change, so how the different actors try to change the rules of the game, the social order. And also here is value dependence in space and time. And the last one, we know that this entrepreneurial ecosystem concept focus on entrepreneurs as a special actor. Okay, but the most puzzling question here that how can we measure what research method would be the best suited for this study? Professor Erko Autio offers a very hands-on summary about an overview about the evolution of entrepreneurial measurements, a distinguished output, attitude, framework, weighted, and ecosystem type of measures. And in this report, he mentioned the main merits and also the shortcomings of these different type of measures as well. So, for example, the main problems with the output measures, we know that they use very, let's say, simple measures like number of firms or business density. but they cannot they cannot handle the quality-related entrepreneurship, and they cannot handle innovation. Okay, the attitude type of measures, they focus on the social values, social norms, and also the different attitudes of entrepreneurs. The framework measures focus on the different institutions, how they change the actor's behavior, but both the attitude and the framework measure actually cannot, they do not reflect the multidimensional feature of entrepreneurship. And about the weighted measure and the ecosystem measure, here I listed some of the most important shortcomings. And one of the weighted measure or ecosystem measure I'm quite familiar with, this is the Regional Entrepreneurship and Development Index, the REDI. I promise I won't go into the details. I won't talk about the REDI structure and the methodology. I just would like to highlight some important points with regard to this index. It's an analytical tool, and it's measured the performance of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I think it's big advantage that that it can reflect this multidimensional nature of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, because it also consists the individual factors, so it measures the different attitudes, abilities, and aspirations of the entrepreneurs, but also it reflects the institutional context. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, that if we want to understand the interrelatedness of the entrepreneurial ecosystem actors, and actually the REDI as a weighted measure use this penalty of bottleneck methodology, which actually based on already existing theories which offer a solution. How can we improve the performance of the entrepreneurial ecosystem? But it's a different thing than observing this interrelatedness. And okay, the third point is I would like to highlight some promising research methods here. What are these? Here is network analysis. Actually, this is not a new method, but it has a long history, of course, but here in the field of entrepreneurial research, it's quite new. And I found two types of studies here. The first type, focusing networking, which determines the quality of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So here we can find studies that use the different network characteristics as proxies, and they want to, these different characters can explain firm success or entrepreneurship. On the other hand, there are other studies related to networking, and according to that studies, networking is determined by the quality of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So these studies measure the effect of different entrepreneurial ecosystem actors on networking, or the effect of different contextual factors on networking. The other method is the qualitative comparative analysis. This comes derived from sociology, and actually the QCM method doesn't help identify the magnitude of the effect of a specific variable. It's used set theory, Boolean algebra, and it has the potential to reveal the complex interplay of the different factors of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So it can reveal the natural complexity. Here I show, here is this diagram. It shows that nowadays this type of method is very popular here in entrepreneurial ecosystem research. But actually, I think that, I believe that the most important benefit of merit of these QCS studies now that they prove that there are many ways to create a successful ecosystem. But what we can see, another important finding, that if we have different outcome or different policy goals, then these requires different configuration, ecosystem configuration. So if our aim to, well, for example, to increase the number of firms, we will need a different configuration, ecosystem configuration, if our goal is, let's say, that increase the number of gazelles. also a big question that, okay, we know that there are many ways to economic canon, but okay, we are able to identify these different configurations of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, but what is the best for a particular region? So it means that, is it possible to standardize, to use this configuration as standardized recipes? I think, well, if I have to bet, I think the answer is no. Okay, and the next step. Well, again, as I said, the QCA, I can formulate some interesting future research agenda related to this QC-related measures. For example, as I said, nowadays it's a very popular method in the field of entrepreneurial ecosystem, but too much information on the table, and I think we should somehow, collect this information, and I think meta-analysis would be a very good tool for that. And I checked that this is still missing. Also, as I mentioned, one of the important characteristics of entrepreneurial ecosystem that they are value dependent in space and time. So therefore I said that maybe we cannot use the results of this QCA analysis as standardized recipes, but we have to consider this value similarity or difference of our research units. So this is also can be a direction. And also I checked that, okay, we can use this method to reveal the different entrepreneurial ecosystem configuration, but we can also check that these different configuration of regions are spatially autocorrelated, whether they are spatially autocorrelated or not. This can be also an interesting result. And again, this is my last slide. So I just would like to mention the most innovative methods here, which mentioned by the literature, the big data and the artificial intelligence. Actually, I found only papers which try to introduce this method as, innovative methods, and maybe these methods will and can contribute to productive transformation of the whole research field. I also found some papers which just a summary about the big data itself, the methods, what is it, and how can it be used in this field. And I found some papers, only really just some papers, which really use these techniques in their paper, and these were very, very interesting papers. So I'm very eager to know the other panelists and also hear the audience opinion about what they think about these new methods. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So one aspect now you can see that so measurement is also not as an easy thing. But now here will be Marcus Desjardins, who focuses a little bit different aspect of this ecosystem that came out probably in the last 5 years. And that's the governance issues. And there are some who claim that basically this kind of governance is a non-existence in the entrepreneurship ecosystem or spontaneously developing. And that goes back to what Eva already said, that they're probably very difficult to replicate some kind of positive examples in entrepreneurial ecosystem also.
Thank you very much, Laszlo. Thank you also for the invitation to contribute to this roundtable. So I'm Marcus Desjardins. I'm professor of economics at the University of Namur, but also at Université Catholique de Louvain. And as Laszlo mentioned, I had for some years some interest for a systemic approach of entrepreneurship, and probably it comes from, basically, I'm a regional economist, and this entrepreneurial ecosystem concept was particularly developed in entrepreneurship literature, but you could find very nice antecedents, not named entrepreneurial ecosystem, but very nice antecedents in regional economics as well. So, and I will give you a contrasted presentation, given the first presentation we had by Eva. but we need a discussion afterwards. So, so I will speak about the governance of entrepreneurial ecosystem, and I will give you also some what I call bonuses. So let me first of all say something about what personally I consider as some basic about the concept. Okay, so it's a personal view. If I have to retain something from all this, the basic would be for me, first of all, it's an imported concept. It's a concept that was not really, that has not an origin in entrepreneurship literature, and even not in regional economics. You could find the concept in biology, ecology. And for example, I take this definition online. An ecosystem is a system consisting of biotic and abiotic components that function together as a unit. And maybe the word unit should be emphasized, because it will also be a unit of observation later. In geography, you can have this definition taken from National Geographic Encyclopedia entry. An ecosystem is a geographic area where plants, animals, and other organisms, as well as weather and landscapes, work together to form a bubble of life. It's a nice definition. It's something that also we don't have the habit of this type of definition in economics, for example. A bubble of life. I like it. Other basics about the concept. What about giving a definition of the concept in entrepreneurship literature? So there are several definitions. I take this one because I will use it also later. This one is by Stam and Spiegel, 2018. An entrepreneurial ecosystem is a set of interdependent actors and factors coordinated in such a way that they enable productive entrepreneurship within a particular territory. Okay? I like the definition because of the word coordinated, and we will make the link with governance later. And let me also say that by productive entrepreneurship, we should have in mind also that the literature has in general in mind the idea of ambitious entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship that creates wealth and jobs. So from this definition, we can emphasize the fact that we are speaking about interdependent actors and factors, and there are multiple conditions, actors and factors entering into this at the stake of entrepreneurial ecosystem. They are entering a multiplicative rather than an additive model. This is a systemic approach, and this is, I think, really a strong input of this approach, the systemic approach. And let me say very briefly, a multiplicative model means that if you do not have one of the ingredients, the result will be zero. If you have an additive model, even if you do not have one of the ingredients, you can have a result. Okay, so basically, conceptually, this is an idea that should be emphasized. Now, if I look at observations, empirics, it was already mentioned by Eva, observations tend to be summed up as a collection of unique experiences. And I think that is important because it will have important policy implications, this uniqueness of our entrepreneurial ecosystem. I also have some points of attention. I think that, and Alexandra, correct me if I don't pronounce it very well, but I think that entrepreneurial ecosystems are matryoshka doll concept. What is the unit of observation? Is it the municipality, the region? Is it the industry, a very specific industry of the macro industry, or the global economy within a territory? So a matryoshka doll concept. We don't know very much about the dynamics of entrepreneurial ecosystem. We know little about entrepreneurial ecosystem, but also less about the dynamics of that, eventual feedback effects. And recently, it was even proposed an approach based on the complex theory, and Rondi and our co-authors propose entrepreneurial ecosystems as complex adaptive systems. And I will come back later on this. So let me say also as a point of attention, that we all know that reality is complex. But as a scientist, we do not want, by our models, we do not want to replicate reality. Because if we have a model that replicates essentially reality, the result will not be, cannot be attributed to one or another factor. Okay? Because if we observe reality, in general, we don't know what is the most important factors. So a model that replicates reality, from my point of view, has little value. Okay? So I think that the modeling, in a scientific sense, is not trying to replicate reality. But still, I think that there is an added value with systemic approach, and I think we could see systemic and analytical approaches are as complements to produce knowledge. What about governance? So this was the definition I selected, the one by Stam and Spiegel, and as already mentioned, you have this word coordinated. So interdependent actors and factors coordinated. And the word coordinated suggests a link with governance. So what is governance? It's also something difficult to define. So looking for a definition, I found this one by Marc Bevere, he's a political scientist. Governance is, and you will see it's very vast as a concept. All processes of governing, whether undertaken by government, market, or network, whether over a family, tribe, formal or informal organization, or territory, and whether through laws, norms, power, or language. Of course, this definition has to be adapted for the entrepreneurial ecosystem, okay? But I think it's a nice definition, or a very generic one of what is governance. So when we refer to entrepreneurial ecosystem, we can raise then some questions. First of all, let me emphasize that there is no one single type of governance. There are many types of governance. Notably, there could be more or less democratic, more or less decentralized, more or less cooperative, more or less participatory. Okay? So what type of governance could be seen as a factor that will enable an entrepreneurial ecosystem to flourish? I don't have any idea of it. If I look at the literature, you will see that maybe literature has something in mind, but conceptually and maybe even a bit normatively. So questions that we have, does the type of governance, rather the governments matter to explain the entrepreneurial ecosystem performance? And we need to have in mind a measure for performance. Is it GDP per capita? Is it the growth of GDP per capita? Is it some measurement, maybe synthetic measures for sustainability? So performance is also a multi-dimensional concept, or could be declined in very different senses. So how it could explain, governance could explain the performance, and how much? We don't know. Basically, we don't know. A single optimal model is a question. Is there somewhere a single optimal model? Or can poor governance, in some cases, be compensated by other factors? So, and the idea of single optimal model is, in a way, in the complex adaptive systems approach. Rondi is explaining, and it's also taken from complex theory, that about governance on these systems, entrepreneurial ecosystems exhibit self-organization. That's a proposition for defining the concept from a CAS approach. But what does it mean? Order that emerges do so without a global controller. Okay? Of course, it's a concept, but in reality, then, if we do not have an observation of another reality, and this reality is not an entrepreneurial ecosystem, I ask the question. I think it's an entrepreneurial ecosystem, but not conform to this proposition. That's, in a way, a normative proposition from my point of view. Conclusion, I think we are ignorant. As a reminder, I would say also that we are ignorant, but probably by combining systemic and analytical approach, we can learn more about entrepreneurial ecosystem. But maybe it's time not to develop concepts and so on, but it's time to collect more sound empirical material. It could be quantitative, it could be qualitative. From the quantitative side, it has been presented to Redai. I think it's a convincing way to measure it. But maybe there are other, and if we want to link also these measurements to understand what is happening, we need also more qualitative case studies maybe. So it's time to collect sound empirical material and building, so confirmed, there is a replication issue there, and therefore substantiated evidence. My last slide is some points I would like to emphasize in preparation of the policy issue, and I don't want to overlap with the contribution of Rolf in a moment, but yeah, there is an observations. There are observations. And observations, as I said, tend to be summed up as a collection of unique experiences. A consequence from that is that there would be no one-size-fits-all to entrepreneurship policy. Every policy, if you want to intervene, should be adapted. Okay? Yeah, but what do we mean by policy? And here I refer to the classical distinction between, in German, what was said to be an Ordnungs- or a Prozesspolitik. And Ordnungs is more about the framework. Prozesspolitik is more intervening in the process, so by targeted action. So if I refer to this distinction, even if we do not know a lot about entrepreneurship, even if there is no one-size-fits-all policy, this does not prevent thinking about general policies to create a favorable network to foster entrepreneurship, rather than seeking to intervene for specific action. Let me finish by that. Nothing is simple. It's not simple to be a policymaker. I'm convinced about that. But here I refer to a paradox inherent to, it's an adaptation of Aldrich, inherent to entrepreneurial ecosystems. In the original citation by David Aldrich, it was about the entrepreneurial society, not entrepreneurial ecosystem. But the society could be seen as the biggest, as the largest ecosystem in a way. And he said about, so entrepreneurial society, but I adapt it for entrepreneurial ecosystem, what frames entrepreneurial ecosystem does not necessarily contribute to their constructions. So if I interpret that, we come back to the problem of the unit of observation. This observation is within a context. So if you want to explain this unit of observation, what do you take within the context? A context in itself in another context. And we come back to the Russian doll idea. Okay, thank you very much, and maybe I was too long. I let the floor.
Thank you very much, and now we can listen to this, the regional aspect of this entrepreneurial ecosystem, and Rolf Sternberg is giving his presentation.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Rolf Sternberg. I'm a professor of economic geography at the Leibniz University of Hanover in Germany. I will not talk about the policy aspects now, but I will talk about a more or less personal assessment of the entrepreneurial ecosystem concept from a research perspective. mainly. But I think this will be a good basis for the discussion among all of us regarding policy implications, because there are a lot of policy implications included implicitly. I do very much profit from the previous speakers, of course, so I can speak a little bit shorter than expected, because several things have already been said, and these were important things. So I will try to focus on the strengths and weaknesses of the entrepreneurial ecosystem concept, EES, abbreviated, from a research perspective. I think it's definitely needed to discuss the problem or the issue of definition. At least in the scientific world, you need more or less precise definitions. Definitely you need definitions, operationalized definitions, if you would like to measure something. Before you can measure something, you have to define it precisely as possible. And I'm personally been a fan of definitions that are related to the word, to the term that they should define: entrepreneurial ecosystems. So therefore, my favorite definition is from Mason and Brown, a little bit longer, but it includes a set of interconnected entrepreneurial actors, entrepreneurial organizations, institutions, and entrepreneurial processes, which formally and informally coalesce to connect, mediate, and govern the performance within the local entrepreneurial environment. Quotation stops. Included in the word entrepreneurial ecosystems are the words system and eco. System, we have already heard this, comes from the biological ecosystem terminology, and it means that it is the constant interaction of all components and the emerging networks that make up and define an ecosystem. Saltanach and his colleagues transferred this idea first to the national entrepreneurial ecosystems, later on then by Redeye and other concepts to the subnational level of regions. But the definition of the systemic character is the same and should be the same. The dynamic, institutionally embedded interaction between entrepreneurial attitudes, ability, and aspirations by individuals, which drive the allocation of resources through the creation and operation of new ventures. So there are some important restrictions. The entrepreneurship does not, and EES do not consider all companies and all firms, but mainly young new ventures. This is not always the case, but I'm a fan of this kind of definition. And the ecosystemic means, as for all complex adaptive systems, you have already mentioned, Markus, that one component considered in isolation is not enough to produce a good entrepreneurial ecosystem or to distinguish it from a bad one. So you have to consider all components or elements or conditions, as they call it in the literature, not just one or two or three. I think it's important to relate the input factors with output factors. And we have already heard in the very first presentation that the causality is not always clear. Sometimes the same aspect is considered as an input factor, and in other EES research, they are considered as an output factor. For example, the number of innovative new ventures in a region. This is a problem for a theory or a concept from my perspective. I like the concept of Eric Stamm very much. You have already cited his definition. In the core of Eric Stamm's idea of entrepreneurial ecosystems, there are, so as he called them, conditions or elements. So in total 10 conditions, entrepreneurial ecosystem conditions, 6 systemic conditions or elements, including networks, leadership, finance, talent, knowledge, and support services, and 4 so-called framework conditions, including formal institutions, culture, physical infrastructure, and demand. The total of these conditions or elements are related to 2 other aspects. The first one are social values. These social values of the population living and working in the area are EES specific, meaning that they are not the same in different EES. They differ. Each EES differs from each other EES. Social values regarding entrepreneurship, of course. The second aspect related to the 10 conditions is also EES specific. This has to do with individuals' attributes, not social values, but individual attributes, for example, psychological ones, motivational ones, and others, also related to entrepreneurial activities. And these 2 blocks are also interrelated. Social values have an impact on individuals' attributes and the other way around. An output factor, not an input factor, an output factor of EES, according to STUM, is entrepreneurial activity. Not entrepreneurial activity in general, but what they call ambitious entrepreneurship or productive entrepreneurship. And both things are very similar. So the social values, in combination with the EES conditions, have an impact on entrepreneurial activity within this EES. The entrepreneurial activity have an effect on output, not outcome, output. For example, new jobs. For example, value added, GDP and others. And to be honest, most of the policy makers are not interested in entrepreneurship per se, but they consider this as a means to increase GDP or to lower unemployment and these things. And finally, the output, the entrepreneurial output, might result in outcome, social, economic outcome, like socioeconomic development, for example, like well-being, or like even happiness. All these things are measured by economists and others. And finally, these outcome aspects have an impact on the EES conditions again. So it's really a system. But the system is not yet completed, as there are regional, so subnational, regional framework conditions that also have an impact on the conditions named before. And STUM divide them into 2 parts. Efficiency enhancers, for example, higher education and training, labor market efficiency, or technological readiness of the employers and employees in the region. And the second part are basic requirements like institutions, simple availability of institutions, infrastructure, or macroeconomic stability. So this is a system-related understanding of what an EES might be. And in principle, all of these elements are measurable in principle. Some of them are easily to measure, others are more difficult to measure. The main arguments of the EES literature are the following ones from my perspective. First, the elements of an EES create a system and influence each other, but can never completely replace each other. It's an attribute of a system in general. Individuals, organizations, and institutions are the actors within an EES. Third, the number, the quality, and the growth of new ventures in a geographical area depend primarily on their networking with their environment. So networking or interacting is a very crucial aspect within EES. What follows from this is that the consistency and intensity of exchange among the elements and actors are guarantees for a so-called strong EES compared with a weak one. The network density and the symmetry may differ within the same EES and has an influence on the performance of the EES, whether it is a strong one or weak one, or whether it is no EES at all. Then entrepreneurs are the main drivers of these kind of systems. The older among us might remember the so-called regional innovation systems, or the regionally interpreted network theory. There, government actors were very often in the center of the argumentation. In the EES concept, the entrepreneurs are in the focus when actors are considered, not policymakers. The attributes and network relations of the elements are specific for each EES. They are unique, you have already mentioned this. That means that the transferability is limited, although policymakers very much like to transfer one basic idea to almost all other regions. But this is not possible if you take the definition of EES, of an EES, seriously. A consequence of this is, at least from my perspective, only some subnational regions within a country are or have an EES, not each region. Same as for regional innovation systems. The strengths of the EES concept are numerous, and I figure out only the three most important ones. It fits very well the ambitious or productive entrepreneurship idea, and thus there's a good link to regional growth regarding theories, regarding policy attempts, and this is a comparative advantage over several other concepts of regional entrepreneurship. Second, there's an explicit note on the systemic of the spatial and context-related entrepreneurial process. For us, this is common, this is normal now, but 10 or 15 years ago, that was not the case. And this is really a progress from my perspective. And the third aspect regarding policy and policymakers, in principle, there's a high practical applicability. In principle, the very seemingly easy rules of the game are easy to transfer within a given local or regional environment. What is new about the EES concept? As with all new theories or concepts, only part of them are new. All of them are based more or less on elder conceptions. And new is not always good, and good is not always new. Sometimes new concepts are very popular but not good. And older concepts must not be definitely or are not always bad. I think three things are not just new but good. There's an explicit application of the system idea to entrepreneurial activities in a certain territory, a geographical area. Second, the application of the idea of entrepreneurial systems in the form of geographical units is an advantage. We have had many previous regional entrepreneurship studies before the EES concept emerged, but the system idea is a new thing, or was a new thing some 10, 12 years ago. And third, the explicit connection of entrepreneurship on the one hand and innovations and network on the other. They are related, and the EES concept acknowledged this. There are many differences, in particular with two older concepts that are, to a large degree, related to the EES concept. This is the innovation system concept and the network theory or network concept. But there are differences between innovation system and the EES concept, mainly in three perspectives. The EES concept explicitly consider the dynamic perspective. Innovation systems in the original idea did not. They specifically consider the role of each individual actor, also a difference to the traditional innovation system literature. And in particular, they, of course, consider entrepreneurship, while the risk concepts did not. As for the network theory, the differences are in the system orientation. Network theory didn't that. The focus on entrepreneurship, also almost unconsidered within network theory, at least for a long time. And the explicit spatial orientation. Only a very minor part of the network theory was spatially oriented. Let me focus on the weaknesses, and the list is a little bit longer. The weakness list is longer than the strengths list, but nevertheless, I like many aspects of the ES theory, but I also cannot ignore the weaknesses. It is still a very young theoretical concept. Being young is not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes it is. When it comes to the limited empirical evidence, it simply takes time to conduct enough highly qualitative and really scientifically good empirical research on ES. Second, from my perspective, there's a clear lack of a consensual analytical framework. For example, to distinguish between cause and effect. The causality question is not always clearly answered, unfortunately. And this is a problem. Third, policy makers too often ignore a region's specific context. They like instruments that fits in every region all over the world at the same time. But this doesn't happen, it doesn't work. You should definitely honestly consider the local context, and you should honestly check whether your region has the conditions to become a real, strong, good entrepreneurial ecosystem or not. And if the honest answer is no, then you should not try to build up entrepreneurial ecosystem. Same as with clusters 20 years ago, same history. The postulate of the systemic is not yet fully realized. Mainly because the integration of the network theory within the ES concept is still underdeveloped. The potential is there, it's very great, but all of us who are doing empirical entrepreneurship research knows how costly, how difficult sometimes real network analysis, empirical network analysis is. And the optimum would be to consider the interlinkages, the relationships between each actor within a potential entrepreneurial ecosystem. And that costs time and money. The impact of institutions on which geographical level, on the structure and quality of an ES is empirically definitely under-researched. And when considering the empirical studies, unfortunately, case studies still dominating. And there's a lack of comparative research. And finally, the eco is heavily underrepresented in empirical research. Sometimes the systemic is considered, but the ecosystem is unfortunately very often unconsidered. So that the differences between an EES and an ES are mostly ignored. So there are some open research questions to come. I would like to finish and make it very short. 3 big fields. The first big field are the interactions of the context factors I mentioned earlier. The interactions are not very well researched so far empirically. Second, the behavior of new firm founders and established entrepreneurs within the same entrepreneurial ecosystem. And third, the different factors that have an impact on the quality of new ventures, not just quantity, but the quality. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Okay, and I give the floor now to Alexandra. It's in this case, when we are 4, It's something like being the last. This basically gives some kind of opportunity to reflect also to the previous presentations. The floor is yours, Alexandra.
Okay, is it working? Yeah, it does. Hello, everybody. Pleasure to be here. My name is Alexandra Tsvetkova. I lead Spatial Productivity Lab at the OECD Trento Center for Local Development. And I would like, after this really rich research-centered discussion, I would like to bring it more to the policy side and tell you a little bit of stories. And then, yes, I need to reflect on the what was said before. And actually, I was making notes, and luckily, my main points literally are following what has been said already. So we're speaking the same language. Doesn't matter if we are on the policy side or research side. And in particular, Marcus's points were really speaking to what I wanted to say today. He started with why ecosystem concept is important, meaning important for researchers. I would like to start with why this concept is also popular with policymakers. And my perception is that here that it offers us an opportunity of a positive sum game. And like the opposite of it, or the counterfactual of positive sum game, is a zero sum game, which is really big concern for economic development policies. If we are using resources to help one place, we cannot use these resources to help another place. So technically, we are benefiting some places at the expense of other places. And this raises a host of different issues on all different levels. So here in the idea of entrepreneurial ecosystems and entrepreneurial or systematic dynamics, we have a chance of having something, bigger. We put something in, and we hope that if the ecosystem is working, we will get back more. So it is a positive sum game that I think is the reason why policymakers really want to jump on it and use it. The question kind of how to use it and how to create successful ecosystems is a separate issue. And that brings me to my second point. Conceptually, really stepping back and thinking in broad terms, there are only three ways how ecosystems can be created or facilitated by policy action. So out of these three, number 0 is what Rolf has said. Do you have preconditions? Can you build it from scratch? The answer is no, that's not the option. So we kind of discard it. And then if we talk about like actual cases, ecosystem, they consist of specific components, right? And they need to be in the right combination, in the right kind of composition for the whole thing to work as a one unit, like Marcus was saying. So here we can have some components missing. That is one way the policies can approach it. Okay, you evaluate it, you see what is missing, you kind of fill the gaps, and you hope it will work. Another way is that you have components in place, but some of them are not strong enough. So you're kind of, as a policymaker, you need to strengthen these components and again hope that they will start working. Finally, you can have seemingly all components in place. You can have a university, you can have, like whatever. You have everything, it just doesn't interact. There is no systems dynamics. So that's the most important part of the ecosystem, how to launch it, how to start these kind of, units interacting, how components need to work in a systematic way so it gives us back more than we put in. In reality, of course, usually it's a mix of all this, and it's really hard to measure exactly if we are missing something, if something is too weak, or we kind of try to stimulate interactions, but we just somehow fail. So it's like really separate issue because here we're talking more about conceptually. So that's my second point. There are different ways and different kind of components what to look for and how to launch the ecosystem. And finally, I think everybody said how unique the ecosystems are. It means that indeed policies, they're not transferable. Place-sensitive approach is not enough. It has to be like literally place-based. You come, you look what you have, you see how you can strengthen it into something working in a systematic way. And here comes my stories, my examples. And I would like to report to Rolf mostly actually OECD does take the view that we need to really not use instruments everywhere, especially for entrepreneurial ecosystems. My colleagues at the Entrepreneurship Policy and Analysis Unit, they literally come to a region that want to try and build ecosystems. They evaluate it, and they provide policy recommendations how to tailor or how to try to launch this entrepreneurial ecosystem dynamics. And I have a few examples for you, a few stories. So one is work in, I think it is, what's the name? Warwickshire, and in the United Kingdom. So that's a region that has very strong presence of automotive industry. So they have Land Rovers there, they have Aston Martin, they have London Electric Vehicle Company. So these guys are really strong. The sector itself has been in revival recently. They are high tech, they are really they are booming. The rest of the economy, not so much. So it is kind of bifurcated economy with really weak SMEs that are surrounding the strong automotive sector, but SMEs are not serving it. They are not innovative enough. Their capacity is not enough. So among many recommendations that were put in place for this specific case, the one that really kind of comes up to me is that we need to strengthen the innovativeness or innovative capacity of the SMEs that can, so it will allow them to link in value chain relationship with local companies that are much stronger. So that's kind of our second component. You come, you see something is weak, you try to strengthen it, and you hope it will launch ecosystem dynamics. Another case is Mazowiecki region in Poland. It is a region around Warsaw, which is the capital of the country. Here it is also bifurcated, but in a geographical kind of sense. So we have the capital, Warsaw, which is innovative, high value added activities, quite successful in attracting FDIs, home to quite a few large Polish corporations, but the surrounding area is really lagging. So here the main idea is how you can try to launch it into something working synergetically as a unit is to link across space, how to kind of link the periphery to the capital so they can benefit more from our agglomeration economies. So these are two examples. And they are coming from relatively homogeneous kind of cultural perspective. And this comes back to a point made by many speakers on the context. Because in some other contexts, if we move away from this in terms of culture, in terms of institutions, the approach can be completely different. And here I would like to mention a relatively recent study on Colombia done by Jana Schmutzler and her co-author. They were looking at Atlántico department in the country, so Colombia is not Europe, apparently. What happened there? They have quite weak preconditions for entrepreneurship, seemingly. They have relatively high informality rates. The ease of starting business is 4 out of 10. And despite this, they have about 27% of adult population engaged in entrepreneurship, which is 6 points above the national average. They received a bunch of awards for their best policies in field of entrepreneurship. So they are kind of really, in terms of ecosystem approach, they are really visible. And Jana and her co-author tried to understand what happened there. Why did it happen this way? In Colombia, it is something I didn't know. The money or funds for building entrepreneurial or supporting entrepreneurship comes from the national government. So national government sends funds to departmental governments, and they are in charge of designing, entrepreneurship policies. It can be events for kind of building networks, etc., etc. The point is that, again, now we're coming back to cultural and institutional conditions. The trust in the national government is so low that companies and entrepreneurs do not trust these efforts. They do not use them. So it's kind of wasted resources. What happened and this is the same for pretty much all regions in the country, but in this specific region, local chamber of commerce stepped in. They are not governmental agency, they are private kind of entity, but with really strong connections to local business economy, to local entrepreneurs who trust them through, they have social capital, let's put it this way. And they were able to leverage this capital to use money from the national government to build ecosystem. And they specifically decided that they will kind of develop and guide development of an ecosystem as a unit, as a kind of, something. They will not help individual businesses, they will not provide consulting services, they will try to build an ecosystem. They were stepped out of this and were really building connections, like literally introducing entrepreneurs to each other within the region. They evaluated all the support available through public efforts to entrepreneurship, and they realized that they were really focusing on the early stages of entrepreneurial process, like ideation or incubation, but there was no support for acceleration. So what they did, they brought in international entities focusing on providing services in acceleration. They also personally kind of tried to bring innovative entrepreneurs. Some of them came. So the point is that they managed to really build this vibrant ecosystem. And the point is here is that policy, sometimes the best policy is for the government to step back. So that's my last point here. Let me recap. I think the first point I made was that our ecosystem gives us an opportunity for positive sum game, which is a good thing, almost like free lunch that economists do not like. The second one is there are, again, different kind of combinations of specific efforts that are needed, and they are determined by what we see on the ground. And the last point is that even place-sensitive approach is not enough. It has to be unique, it has to be really place-based, it has to be like 3D printing for entrepreneurial ecosystems. Thank you.